Our first speaker is Dr. Susan Dackerman, who, as of next Monday, will be the John and Jill Freidenrich Director of the Iris and B. Gerald Cantor Center for Visual Arts at Stanford University. The title of her talk is Making Prints, Making Metals. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dackerman to the podium.
Thank you, Amy and Robert, for giving me this opportunity to talk about metals. This is my first crack at this, so I appreciate the chance. Wood, metal, stone. Because of the ubiquity of these naturally occurring resources, we often neglect to consider them with any specificity. The precise genus of tree, mineral, or rock, its place of origin, and the methods of its processing and manufacture all speak to why artists and their patrons selected particular materials for specific projects during the early modern period. Through their use, such materials represent a history, a record of their time, place, and significance. In many cases, the materials also contribute to and help convey the meaning of the objects they comprise. My paper today will examine some of the wood, metal, and stone used in the production of early modern German prints and metals, purposefully considering how and why they were chosen. As some of you know, I'm a print scholar, not a scholar of metals or numismatics. I've been invited to this conference commemorating the exhibition of Stephen Scher's and now the Frick's exceptional collection of metals because of late I've been preoccupied with the material means of making early modern prints. This concern has turned the focus of my research to the matrices employed to produce prints, the wood blocks, copper plates, and lithographic stones that convey their inscribed images to paper. I'm struck by the resonances between the materials and processes of making prints and metals in Northern Europe in the 16th through 18th centuries. In traditional scholarship, metals more often are aligned with the work of goldsmiths and sculptors, but as multiples, prints and metals share many characteristics, most especially their means and methods of propagation. Both are produced from durable matrices made of like materials, such as wood models and printing blocks, engraved metal dies and printing plates, cut stone models and lithographic stones. Not surprisingly, these matrices are comprised of native materials, specifically the pear wood, precious and base metals, and limestone that were found in Central and Northern Europe. Obvious but often overlooked, the manufacture of both metals and printed images is the result of subjecting these materials to pressure, creating imprints that reverse the orientation of their matrices. These reversals are built into the conceptualization of the finished objects. I'm here today to offer some very preliminary thoughts on congruencies between the making of prints and metals and how thinking explicitly about the materials and operations of their manufacture might prompt new and different interpretive strategies. The earliest images printed in Germany were woodcuts. The consequence of carving and design into the surface of a block of hard wood, usually pear wood, inking that surface, placing a sheet of paper over the inked surface, and applying pressure via a screw press to the combined block and paper. By the early 16th century, the Nuremberg artist Albrecht Dürer had refined the practice, producing wood blocks and their consequent woodcuts, like these representing an ornamental knot pattern. And so what you see here on the left is the wood block that would have been placed in the bed of the printing press that you see on the right, ink would have been applied to its surface, a sheet of paper placed over that inked surface, and then the screw turned, thereby exerting pressure on that combination and creating the printed image. Although the design is not carved very deeply into the block, only a few millimeters as can be seen from these details, the compression of the printing press ensures that the ink is transferred to the paper. By pushing the raised areas on the surface of the block into the paper, the force of the press also transmits some of the texture of the wood relief to the paper, albeit in reverse. So the impression made is not only that of an inked image, but also one of the relief design from the carved woodblock. This operation, which transfers a reversed indexical impression, is not dissimilar to that necessary for making the mold to cast portrait metals. Portrait metal designers also use the wood of the pear tree to make reproductive matrices. Since the wood models aren't saturated with ink, they maintain a crisper, more refined appearance, as is apparent in this 1519 model for Hans Schwarz's depiction of Martin Tucher. That the fruit tree, native to Central and Eastern Europe, produces reddish-toned wood also contributes to its appeal and has ensured that many of these models survive, seemingly more than pear wood printing blocks. Because it maintains its form and doesn't readily warp, the plentiful wood also was employed in early modern Germany to make musical instruments and fine furniture. Its hardness and fine grain made it easy to work and enabled the incision of subtle details without stripping or chipping the wood with carving tools. As the wood comes from slender fruit trees, it yields modestly sized planks, best suited to small-scaled objects, like metal models or woodblocks for printing. This view of the end grain on the right shows the density of the wood's fibers. And for comparison, you should think about the porosity of the end grain of, say, a pine 2x4 and how splintery it always is. That's not what this wood is like. For these reasons, pear wood was the material of choice for the production of metal models by Schwarz and his Augsburg counterparts. When skillfully handled, the surface of the wood is smooth and relatively grain-free. Ideal for printing without transferring an impression of the plank's inherent architecture, as well as suited to conveying an unblemished portrait to a sand mold for casting into a copper alloy metal. And what I mean by that is here in these areas that are printed from the surface of the block, you can't see the grain of the block at all. You can't see the grain of the wood model here either. And it's the characteristics of the wood that prompted its use for these uses. As we know from various early modern sources, and as so well depicted in the video produced by the Frick, impressing the models, whether of wax, wood, or stone, in a bed of sand enabled the production of a mold which was subsequently used for casting a metal. And while I show this slide as a means of picturing the process, I hope all of you had an opportunity to watch the video that's on view in the galleries, or you could watch it at home on YouTube. One of the critical stages of production, and I would argue the most critical stage, in fact, was the imprinting of the carved relief into the receptive sand ground. Here you see the imprints on the left and right of the reverse and obverse of the model of the Pisanello metal, and you can see that model above. This step created indexical representations of the carved model, the sculptural relief generating inverse concave forms in the pliant red sand. It is these impressions in the dried ground that form the mold for the production of metal casts. The resultant metal, as seen in the Pear on the left, maintains the orientation of the wood model. Unlike the relationship between wood blocks and their resultant printed images, which appear in reverse, as can be seen in this wood block and woodcut from the Morgan Library on the right. This is because the depiction of Tucker has been offset in the sand, a transfer method that would not become common to printmaking until the 20th century. The inscription that surrounds Tucker's profile, however, was achieved in a manner derived from the tools and practices of printing. Once the imprint of the model was impressed in the sand of the mold, metal letterpress characters fashioned in reverse for printing on paper also were impressed in the sand. When filled with molten metal in the mold, these impressions create the raised inscription in the proper orientation for reading. So while the profile of the cast metal has undergone a double reversal, the surrounding text was reversed only once. Thus, the generation of both prints and metals is governed by the logic of impression and reversal. Practice is dependent upon the durability of the agent of generation, or the matrix. In early modern Germany, the ample wood of pear trees offered a material with the necessary characteristics to produce matrices for the propagation of further objects. The wood's exceptional hardiness made possible the preservation of the model's carved relief forms through multiple bouts of pressure. In the case of wood blocks, the pressure of the screw press, and in the case of metals, the stress of repeatedly imprinting the wooden medallions in the sand of the mold, since studies suggest that only 2 or 3 castings could be made from each mold. Those casts, of course, are made of metal, the second material under investigation here. Recent scientific analysis has revealed much about the composition of the metal alloys used in the casting of early 16th century German portrait metals. As Marjorie Trusted claims, although most are called bronze, an alloy comprised of copper and tin, most are actually brass, an alloy of copper and zinc. This is particularly interesting in light of the technological innovations in mining and metallurgy that occurred in southern Germany during the previous century. In the early 1400s, techniques were developed for isolating and processing ores that facilitated, in particular, the production of silver and copper. Although in great demand in Europe and throughout the Mediterranean world, silver had become increasingly difficult to mine and therefore more and more scarce through the late Middle Ages. In mid-15th century Nuremberg, an innovative method of smelting was devised that enabled even greater extraction of silver from the ores mined in Central Europe. These advances in mining and silver smelting also generated the mass production of high-quality copper as a byproduct. The further refinement of that copper engendered the production of the copper alloy brass, which has a lower melting point than copper and can be more expediently fabricated into specialized metal goods, commodities for which Nuremberg and southern Germany were renowned in the early modern period. One of Dürr's most celebrated engravings, printed incidentally from a copper plate, depicts some of the prized products of the city's metal industries: a bell, hammer, blade, scales, nails, and dividers among metal objects. The mass production of these instruments and tools were made possible by the new mining and processing technologies. But back to the metals. Although the Nuremberg Tucker family made their fortune through international trade, by the 16th century, Martin Tucker and his relatives also had significant interests in metal industries. They owned mines, mills, and foundries, selling silver and copper in their raw form and as manufactured goods. Metallurgy was also the source of wealth of other South German patrician merchant families, such as the Fuggers and Scherls. It's worth noting that one of the earliest metals made in Germany, seen at the center, is of Jakob Fugger, an Augsburg merchant who also had extensive mining and foundry interests. Like Tucker's metal, Fugger's seems to point to the significance of its materiality. On the reverse of the medal, seen at bottom center, Apollo places crowns on the heads of Mercury, god of commerce, and Neptune, god of the seas. The Fugger firm controlled the copper market in Europe, and much of the metal produced there was shipped to Venice, where it was routed to destinations in the Eastern Mediterranean. It seems early modern German industrialists, like Tucker and Fugger, may have desired representations of themselves that manifested the materials and manufacturing skills that were the source of their wealth and prestige. Their brass medals, although following an ancient art form, embodied current technological innovations in mining and metallurgy. Matthias Gebel's depiction of the Nuremberg patrician Albrecht Scherl on the right is cast in silver and also speaks to the region's commercial interests and the sitter's identity. Scherl was a silver assayer and mint warden in Saxony, as well as part owner of a silver mine in Bohemia. Further evidence of the significance of silver to the materiality of portrait metals can be inferred from this silver casting of Charles V, intended to be presented to him as a gift on his visit to Nuremberg in 1520. Geoffrey Chip Smith argues that the gift signaled the free imperial city's desire to impress the new emperor with the skill of its goldsmiths and armorers, as well as indicate its mercantile success. More specifically, though, that the finely wrought metal was cast and struck in silver points to the city's industrial sophistication and the major innovations in silver smelting made over the previous century. Now, it's worth noting that Nuremberg's smelting and metal processing enterprises, with their need for fuel furnaces, decimated its surrounding decimated its surrounding forests, and thus its supply of wood. By the 16th century, Nuremberg's citizenry was given priority over commercial firms in the procurement of wood from its surrounding forests, forcing the foundries to move closer to forests in the north of Germany. Although it's often stated in the literature that Augsburg metal makers favored wood for their models, while Nuremberg makers favored stone, the reason for this difference remains unspecified. Perhaps the devastation of Nuremberg's timber supply forced its metal designers to look to another local resource. Solnhofen limestone, quarried in a region of Bavaria a little more than 50 miles to the south of Nuremberg, was the stone preferred by the city's carvers of models for portrait metals. Formed about 150 million years ago when a shallow sea that covered the area disappeared, the late Jurassic limestone deposits were mined in the early modern period for roof and floor slabs, as well as for carving sculpture in relief. The particularly dense and fine-grained sediment of the German Plattenkalk was well suited to capture precise details carved in the stone. The particulate structure of the limestone also could be sanded and polished to a smooth, glossy finish. You'll note that the characteristics of the Solnhofen limestone echo those of European pear wood. Both are described as fine-grained and smooth. So although the Augsburg and Nuremberg makers were using different materials, they were interested in exploiting those properties shared by both. The limestone model for the 1526 medal of Friedrich Beheim is an ideal example of what the stone made possible. The unknown Nuremberg carver incised the profile portrait of the sitter, accentuating the line of his nose and high forehead, curls of his beard, ornamentation of his hairnet, and the folds of his collar and mantle. Most remarkably, however, he captured the wrinkles in his neck, on his cheek, and around his eyes. And I think that some of these lines are truly astounding. The stone's simultaneous density and pliancy made it a receptive ground for these delicate marks, as well as enabled the smooth, high polish of the surface. The resultant portrait in stone is seemingly soft, a quality that is transferred to the cast metal. And I'm showing you here a variation on the metal. You'll see it's not a one-to-one correspondence. The stone's ability to hold the details is notable because compared to Schwarz's wood model for the Tucher metal, the relief doesn't stand very high. Yet both wood and stone had the resilience necessary to withstand multiple imprints in the sand used to make the mold for casting the metals. In the late 18th century, because of these very same qualities, Solnhofen limestone began being used as a printing matrix, supplanting the wood blocks and copper plates that were, from the 15th century, the prevalent material means of making reproducible images. I've argued elsewhere that the identification of the Jurassic limestone as a reproductive matrix derives from the history of the stone itself. Besides being well-suited to carving precise details and to capturing the minute marks of a lithographer's crayon, its fine sediment also made it an ideal environment for the preservation of fossils. Solnhofen limestone is most famous because it made it possible to construct a history of extinct species, as well as enabled naturalists to formulate the idea of extinction in the 18th century. So if you Google Solnhofen limestone, what you'll get is page after page after page on fossils. The limestone excavated in the 16th century for carving relief plaques and matrices for metals also must have contained fossilized remains, forms set in stone over 100 million years earlier. Alois Sennefelder, the inventor of lithographic printing, described the prevalence of fossils in the Solnhofen limestone, claiming, "It is rare to find a stone as large as a sheet of notepaper that is entirely free of little defects, such as yellowish and gray spots and impressions of fossil plants and fishes," end quote. The happenstance that indexical records of plants and fish already were embedded in the stone may have suggested that further representations could be extracted from it through carving and then casting those forms, processes not unlike fossilization, which also is dependent upon impression and filling the negative spaces with another material. Although often misunderstood, fossils are not the remains of specimens, but are formed when organic matter, such as animal and plants, decay, and the impression left by their absent forms are replaced by minerals from groundwater and sediment. Metals, like fossils, also are formed in sediment, the space left by the impression of the model filled with a molten copper alloy. As in the fossilization process, the casting is sometimes imperfect, but the forms produced mimic a historical process of reproduction while simultaneously making and reflecting a history of their own. In conclusion, considering the specificity of the wood, metal, and stone used in the production of early modern German prints and metals invites alternative views of their history and meaning. That history includes a record of the existence exploitation, and depletion of the region's natural resources, as well as its industrial innovations and accomplishments. Many of the figures depicted on German portrait medals were affiliated with these materials and their manufacture, immortalized in the wood, metal, and stone that determined their legacies. Thank you.